All right, so we're going to talk about sewage treatment today. And, well, yeah, I just can't stop myself. I have to say that this is a pretty shitty topic. But there you go. So let's start, actually, before we go into the PowerPoint, let's start by looking at IvGid's page about what actually happens here in Incline Village when you flush the toilet, or when you run your dishwasher, or when you rinse something down the sink or down the shower. This is where it ends up. And actually, this is one of the field trips that we missed out on, if you call it that. It's kind of stinky there, but we would have gone to learn directly about how this process occurs. So here's some data. Look at this. Every year, and this is just Incline Village, keep in mind, Incline Village only, 474 million gallons of sewage every year. Over 100 miles of gravity lines. That means they're just pipes that everything just flows downhill by gravity. And 14 miles of sewer force main lines. I believe that means it has to be pumped. And these are between 6 and 24 inches in diameter, these pipes. 1,900 sewer manholes, 19 pump stations. Oh, did I fail to say share? I did fail to say share. Huh? Thanks for the note. Now are we there? Cool. So, as I was saying, this is the website for IvGid's sewer system here. And this is one of the stages in sewer treatment where they have these kind of ponds that allows everything to settle. And what else were we saying? 20 miles of effluent pipeline to the Carson Valley. So effluent is the water coming out of the sewage treatment plant. It still has lots of nutrients in it. So there is now a law at Tahoe that no sewage can be pumped into the lake. It used to be very common for every waterway basically in the world to collect sewage from people. And as our populations grew, we started building sewage treatment plants, and most of them still put their effluent into some waterway, a river, a lake, or an ocean. But with Tahoe, all the sewage is pumped out of the basin. So none of those nutrients end up in the lake. And we have 20 miles worth of pipeline that takes all the treated sewage water, the treated wastewater, and it takes it to a wetland in Carson Valley, to this 900-acre wetland site near Minden and Gardnerville, I believe. So this treatment plant is able to treat 2 million gallons a day, and I think further down it says, here it is, a normal day, 1.3 million gallons of wastewater flows into that treatment plant. And that's just Incline Village. That seems like a lot of caca to me. But that's pretty standard for American water use. Because again, it's not just the toilet, it's also all of your sinks and your showers, your dishwasher, your washing machine. Not stormwater, though. This would not count stormwater. That does flow directly into the lake. So any water that you see flowing down the street and then it goes down into a grate, into pipes, that's a stormwater drainage system. And that stuff does go directly to the lake without any treatment. And so that, if it picks up any non-point sources of pollution, that gets carried into the lake. But anything that goes into this wastewater treatment plant ends up being treated, reducing the harm that it can cause, and then it goes to a wetland, which actually serves as a natural form of sewage treatment beyond what we've got right here in Incline Village. So this process in Incline takes about 15 hours. the solids removed from the process. I think you know what we're talking about here. The solids are sent to Bentley Ranch for composting with other organic material. I don't know where Bentley Ranch is, but they're going to dry out the solids. They separate them out and they dry them out and then they work them into the soil. Then the export pipeline transports the plant's secondary treated effluent to the Ivgid wetlands in Douglas County. The wetlands facility, largely funded by the EPA. And basically what happens here, it's final treatment that is based on evaporation of water, transpiration, because the plants are absorbing some of the water and then release it through their leaves, and percolation, where some of the water seeps into the soil. There are several lagoons, and it's actually going to help these wetland plants grow. It's basically providing them with fertilizer, and this is also providing habitat for any wetland animals. They're saying there's over 70 species of birds and mammals that live in those wetlands. So that's what happens when you flush the toilet here in Incline. Let's look at kind of the more generalized approach. One of the unique aspects of Incline is pumping it out of the basin. But beyond that, it's going to be pretty similar to what we're going to talk about here. So, sorry about that. This is what we're calling tertiary. That means it has 3 levels. Now at Incline, there's only 2 levels of treatment, secondary sewage treatment. So this is an aerial view of the sewage treatment plant for Reno and Sparks. And the Truckee Meadows water reclamation facility. This is the Truckee River on its way to Pyramid Lake. Right here is Steamboat Creek coming in from Washoe Valley. Washoe Lake empties into Steamboat Creek. Eventually, it makes it in Sparks to the Truckee River. So we have primary treatment, secondary treatment, and tertiary treatment going on here, and then the water is put, the effluent is put back into Steamboat Creek. So this is a natural creek, and the sewage pipelines bring the water into the facility where it goes through all these different stages, works its way through these towers and these tanks, and then it ends up being released back into Steamboat Creek, which takes it into the Truckee River, which takes everything down to Pyramid Lake. So Incline, like I said, pumps it to the wetlands in the Carson Valley. North Shore, the California side, I can't speak for Crystal Bay on the Nevada side of the peninsula, but on the California side, there are pump stations that move the sewage to Truckee, where it gets treated, probably also secondary level of treatment, and then it gets put into the Truckee River. So I know at the beach that's right by my house, Speedboat Beach, there's this green box there, and you can hear it running every now and then, and that green box is the sewage pump line. So basically the neighborhood sewage lines go downhill until they hit just above the lake, and then they get pumped along the edge of the lake to Truckee, along the edge of the lake and then along the river until they get to the treatment plant in Truckee. So let's look at these 3 levels of treatment. But first, why are we bothering learning about sewage in the first place? Well, I think you would agree with number 1, it's pretty nasty. And with so many people in the world now, it would be a terrible mess if we didn't clean it up. And when I say a mess, specifically what I'm talking about, number 2, it is filled with nutrients. Sewage is a form of fertilizer. That's why we use cow manure for fertilizer. And all those nutrients, if we were to just put them into an aquatic ecosystem, they would cause eutrophication and algae blooms. And at Tahoe, they would decrease the lake's clarity. As the algae grows, the lake becomes less clear. That's why one way to keep Tahoe Blue is to clean up your dog poo because it's also filled with nutrients. And runoff is going to eventually carry those nutrients. If you leave the dog doo on the ground, the runoff is going to carry those nutrients down into the lake eventually. And that's going to feed the algae, and it's going to cause eutrophication in Tahoe. It's going to increase algae growth, which decreases clarity. So clean up after your dog. Sewage also often carries infectious diseases and parasites. For example, cholera and tapeworm. These guys are found in sewage, and one way it spreads is that, people often historically disposed of their poop in the water. And so the person that had a disease or a parasite basically was putting that in the water, and then it would get carried downstream to where the next person would use it for drinking water, and they would pick up that parasite or that disease. Fourth, sewage often includes other materials that people flush or rinse down the drain. So some of these might be molecules, some of them might be objects, and they can harm ecosystems. So these might be heavy metals, which are harmful. They might be hormones, or they might be medications that people flush down the toilet. Hormones can come, for example, from women on birth control pills can actually release hormones into the sewage system that can influence aquatic organisms when they build up enough. And then garbage, people flush things down the toilet that they shouldn't, and it ends up being a problem at the sewage treatment plant. I've heard that one of the big issues actually is tampon applicators, the little plastic applicators kind of shaped like a torpedo, and so they just go right through the main screens that are meant to take out little twigs and stuff, and they go right through those screens because they're aerodynamic, and then they end up being a problem for the sewage treatment plant. So I know the operators of those plants always ask us when we do a field trip to put those applicators in the garbage and not flush them down the toilet. Finally, a good reason to learn about sewage is that there are good paying careers related to it, like wastewater treatment engineers. These guys have to design the wastewater treatment facility, and they have to monitor it to make sure that it is up to standards and not releasing wastes back into the waterways. Okay, so in Truckee Meadows, meaning Reno and Sparks, they process 26 million gallons of sewage a day. It costs $200,000 a month to run it. And in an example of cogeneration, the digesters that are breaking down the sewage release methane, which is trapped and used to run an electrical power plant. And that's going to reduce their electricity costs. Okay, some vocab. So as I said, effluent is the water that comes out of the system. So the effluent is the water after it has been treated. Would you want to drink it? I don't know. It's probably safe enough to drink, but it's probably high in nutrients. It's probably also very high in chlorine because they do add chlorine at the end to kill the bacteria. Next, sludge. This is the solid material that they allow to sink to the bottom of these tanks, and then they clean it out of the tank. So this would include feces as well as garbage and paper that ended up in the sewage treatment plant. Normally, toilet paper is specifically made to break down quickly. If you've ever been out on a boat, they have special marine toilet paper that breaks down very quickly, and usually on boats, they're very picky about what gets flushed down the toilet. Now, one of the processes they use is sedimentation, which allows gravity to remove the heavy materials from the water. We just put the sewage into a tank and let it settle for a day or whatever. We allow the heaviest things to sink to the bottom, and then we skim the water off the top and treat it further. Every now and then, maybe once a month, maybe once a year, I don't know how often, but they will have to remove the sediments that built up in the bottom of that tank. That's what they were talking about, the solids that they take to the ranch for composting. Aeration. In another step, we provide air for bacteria, and the bacteria help digest the organic wastes. So for instance, there are proteins and DNA in feces, and the aerobic bacteria are going to break these down into simpler compounds. So we actually grow these bacteria in a biological process to help break down the organic waste. And basically, this is just like a food web where the decomposers recycle the materials. Flocculation. So in this case, flocculation uses chemicals. Alum is one of them, or there's another one known as PAC. And these attract small particles into clumps. So this works along with sedimentation. So sedimentation, the heaviest things sink really fast, right? But there are still smaller particles that take a while to sink. And so if we can clump them together to be a bigger particle, they will sink out of the water more easily. So flocculation and sedimentation often done together. Sometimes they do a first round of sedimentation, and then they do a second round in combination with flocculation. Filtration is when they run the water through sand and charcoal to remove particles and other molecules that are attracted to carbon. So carbon filters are often used in aquariums, for example, and they can remove these molecules that bond with the carbon. And so we run some of the sewage treatment water through this as well. And at the very end, we want to kill off all the bacteria, so they add chlorine to it. There's often another step after this where they have to remove the chlorine before they put it back into the aquatic ecosystem. So you add chlorine to kill the bacteria, then you remove the chlorine so it doesn't kill the wild bacteria and other organisms. Okay, so on the flow chart, the first thing I wanted you to write down was something about primary treatment. And you should just be able to do this on the back of the page. So primary treatment, the first of three steps, primary, secondary, and tertiary. And each of these has sub-steps within it. But primary treatment is always a physical process or a mechanical process. And it's focused on removing solids by allowing them to settle out of the wastewater. So it's the sedimentation step we were talking about earlier, where we allow the heaviest things to sink to the bottom. Also, often there is some floating material, and that can be separated from the wastewater by scraping it off of the surface. So this like foam or suds or floating trash in the wastewater can be also separated during primary treatment. Again, the focus is that primary treatment is always a physical process. We don't use chemicals, we don't use bacteria in primary treatment. And it's the first thing we do. So on the flow chart, you're going to see a series of numbers that correspond to these numbers. Basically, we're going to see a key here. So here's some of my ex-students on a field trip to the Reno Sparks sewage treatment plant. They're looking down inside here, and there's a big screen. In fact, it doesn't look too different than this railing that removes large debris that got in there. And here's our primary sedimentation tanks that allow time for the heavy particles to sink out of the water. So these are primary treatment. Okay, so step one, toilets, sinks, showers from homes and businesses send wastewater to the treatment plant. And then we jump into the physical processes of primary treatment. So on the flow chart, you'll see a bar screen, number 2, that removes the large debris. Then that is gathered up and taken to a landfill. Step 3, the grit chamber allows dense objects like gravel to sink quickly out of the water. Step 4, our settling tank or sedimentation tank, the first one, the primary one, it gives time for the organic material to sink out of the water. We can also remove some floating material. So when it says suspended, what we're talking about here is objects that are not dissolved. They're kind of floating around in the water. They're suspended in the water. They're not sinking to the bottom. They're not floating to the top, but they're not dissolved either. So these are usually larger than individual molecules. And once again, this PowerPoint will be available for you to fill in any missing details that you didn't get on the flow chart as I moved through it. So this is all primary treatment. That takes us to the next level of treatment, secondary treatment. So secondary treatment always uses biological processes. So pretty much always bacteria. Sometimes they might use worms that help break down the sewage particles. At any rate, it's always organisms in secondary sewage treatment. So the sewage treatment plant for IVGID does primary and secondary. In Reno, they also do tertiary. Tertiary is much more common in larger communities, partly just because they have more of a problem because there's so many people, but they also have more people contributing money to be able to pay for that level of treatment. So here's some secondary treatment sections in Reno. So these are aeration tanks where we provide oxygen to the bacteria that are digesting the organic materials. And then we have another sedimentation tank over here, our second sedimentation tank. So we let the stuff settle for a little bit, pump the water in, give oxygen to the bacteria. We also have to inoculate it with the bacteria that are going to help break things down. And then we let it settle a second time. Okay, so these biological processes really include these two primary steps: the aeration tank that allows the bacteria to digest dissolved organics, and biodegradable oxygen-demanding organic wastes. So what they mean by oxygen-demanding organic wastes is that some materials, like sewage in general, when you put it in a natural ecosystem, as the bacteria decompose that material, it takes oxygen out of the water, just like we were talking about a dead zone with the bacteria that take oxygen out of the water. So we call it BOD, biological oxygen demand. And that is a measurement of how clean the water is. If it's low oxygen demand, that means that there's not much waste in it, and it's cleaner than something with high oxygen demand that has a lot of waste in it that's going to require that oxygen to feed the bacteria that are breaking down that waste. So low BOD is good. It allows high oxygen levels. Dissolved oxygen, DO, is what we refer to. And then we have our second settling tank. Provides the same purpose. It just gives time for material to sink out of the water column. And again, that tank gets filled up over time, and then they have to clear it out. They probably have to have more than one of these so that there's always one operating. If 1 million gallons are coming down every day, they can't exactly just say stop. They just have to switch which tank is being used. While they're cleaning one out, they have to be using a different one and then switch back and forth between them, or maybe to have 10 of them. Depends on the size of the community. Okay, third level treatment, which does not occur in Incline, but it does happen in Reno. And these are a variety of different processes that further purify the wastewater. They could be biological, they could be physical processes, they're often chemical processes. And it might include methods of removing nitrates and phosphates, which are our primary nutrients that are causing eutrophication, so we want to get them out of there, and they do that in Reno. Disinfecting the water with chlorine is another one that would be considered tertiary. They do that in Reno. I think they may do that in Incline as well, but they don't remove the nitrates and phosphates, I don't think. So here's where we're precipitating phosphate. It's a big, tall tank. You can see, and these are the nitrification towers, but we use chemical processes to remove these phosphates. And over here, we're getting these biological processes to remove more nitrogen. What I really liked about the sewage treatment plant in Reno was this nitrogen removal process, which ends up, the final product is N2 gas, just regular nitrogen gas, and so it's just released into the atmosphere. So that nitrogen is completely removed from the water before it returns to the Truckee River. I just thought that was an elegant solution, because nitrogen gas is the major component of our atmosphere, so putting it in the atmosphere doesn't have that much impact. So here's what happens in Reno for this third level treatment. The nitrification towers remove nitrates in a two-part process. Bacteria convert ammonia nitrogen into nitrate nitrogen, NH4 to NO3, and then the NO3 goes to the denitrification facility, which uses another type of bacteria to convert nitrate nitrogen into nitrogen gas, and that gas is just released into the air. So it's kind of part of the nitrogen cycle, where we're using these denitrifying bacteria, we're using some other kinds of nitrogen fixing bacteria. And then they have yet another settling tank for the suspended organic material to sink out of the water, so they can remove any solids. It's getting cleaner and cleaner now, clearer and clearer, but there's still some particles that we want to give them some more time to settle down to the bottom. We run the water through these filters, layers of sand and charcoal, to clean it up even more. And all right, so basically, from what I remember, the whole process starts over here, and this is where that bar screen was. And then these are the primary settling tanks. And these are the aeration tanks. Oh wait, these are. You can see the white because the water's splashing in there. They're actually got these little jets of water that are aerating the water just with the atmosphere. And then here's another whole row of settling tanks. Actually, by the color, I'm going to guess that these are the primary settling tanks. Then it gets aerated, the bacteria break it down, and it goes to the secondary settling tanks over here. Here's these denitrification towers. Here's the phosphate removal facility. Final settling and filtration is in here. They add chlorine, and then they remove it again before they put it back into the Steamboat Creek. Okay, and then these tanks over here, this is where they're recycling the methane that's released in the process of decomposition to actually make some of their own electricity by burning that methane. Okay. So at the end, we have a few steps. We have the chlorine contact tank. that kills these bacteria. And then we have to dechlorinate that water because we wouldn't want to harm aquatic organisms that are in the actual stream that we're going to put the water into. Then we release the effluent into a river, a lake, an ocean, or in the case of Incline Village, into a wetland. Sometimes that's also known as the outfall. We also have a sledge digester. And I think this is what they're doing with the solids. So they collect the sludge from the sedimentation tanks, and it's further degraded by bacteria. I think these are the ones that release the methane that they trap. And then in some cases, they dry out the sludge before they take it away. Now, the reason they'd want to do that is just to save money. It's going to be a lot lighter weight if it's dry than if it's wet. So then they haul this dried sludge away. Some of it goes to landfills. Some of it might be used in soil for compost. Apparently that's what's happening here in Incline. Oh, okay, so here's some labels. You're going to flush it. We have the bar screen and grit chamber. We have the primary tanks. Yeah, the color was the clue for me. We have the aeration tanks. We have the secondary tanks, secondary sedimentation, the nitrification towers, denitrification facility releasing N2 gas into the air, secondary settling tanks and gravity filters, chlorine contact tank, and then the effluent is released. Actually, I don't think it goes straight into the Truckee. I think it goes into Steamboat Creek over here somewhere, but that goes right into the Truckee River within 5 minutes.